the ship screamed. It was not the festive blast of the horn that had sent them off from a sun-drenched port, but a metallic, grinding shriek from its very soul, a sound of immense machinery tearing itself apart deep within the vessel's guts. The lights on the Odyssey of the Seas flickered once, twice, then surrendered to an oppressive, emergency red gloom. Then came the silence, a void more terrifying than the preceding noise, punctuated only by the howl of the storm and the sickening lurch of the powerless ship on the mountainous waves. Amelia Hayes gripped the polished railing of the Grand Promenade, her knuckles white. Around her, the festive atmosphere of the cruise had evaporated into a mist of raw panic. People were shouting, crying, stumbling in the semi-darkness. But Amy's face was a mask of unnerving calm. Her gaze was distant, not focused on the chaos around her, but on the rhythm of the ship's fall and rise against the black, churning water. She felt the sea's pulse, a predator testing the weakened shell of its prey. This feeling, this cold, analytical dread, was an old, unwelcome friend. It had been years since she'd felt it, a ghost from a life she had tried to leave behind in the dust of Fallujah and the engine rooms of gray-hulled warships. A voice, crackling with static and a thick layer of arrogance, burst from the ship's intercoms. "This is your chief engineer, Dmitry Volkov. We have experienced a minor technical issue with the primary propulsion. There is no cause for alarm. My team has the situation completely under control." Amy closed her eyes. Minor technical issue. The words were a lie, a placating bomb for the ignorant. She knew the sound of a catastrophic failure. The shudder that had run through the deck was no mere hiccup. It was the death rattle of a turbine, a cascade failure that no single team could easily contain, especially not in a storm like this. She was just a tourist now, a former Marine trying to find her footing in a world that no longer required her specific, violent brand of expertise. She had booked this cruise to feel normal, to watch sunsets and read novels, to be anonymous. But as the ship gave another horrifying groan and listed hard to port, sending a wave of panic screams through the corridors, she knew her anonymity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The silence from the engine room was a spreading cancer. On the bridge, Captain Elias Vance, a man whose crisp white uniform suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, stared at the dead instrument panels. His ship, a floating city of steel and light, was now little more than a cork in a maelstrom, drifting at the mercy of the wind and currents. His communications officer held a satellite phone, his face pale. "Captain, I've got the Coast Guard. They can have a tug here in 18 hours. 18 hours, Vance ran a hand over his face. In this sea, 18 hours was an eternity. They'd be dashed against the Furies, a notorious string of offshore reefs, in less than 6. His knuckles were white on the console. He was a good captain, a man of procedure and calm authority, but he was a navigator, a manager of men. The intricate heart of his ship, the engine room, was Dmitry Volkov's kingdom, and right now, that kingdom was in ruins. He keyed the intercom to the engineering deck. "Dmitry, talk to me. Give me something." Volkov's voice came back, tight and defensive. "I told you, Captain, we are handling it. It's a complex diagnostic. These things take time." The arrogance was still there, a brittle shell over a core of rising panic. Vance knew his chief engineer was proud, famously so. He was also stubborn and dismissive of any opinion but his own. He was a master of peacetime operations, but this was something else entirely. This was a battle, and Vance was beginning to fear his chief warrior was out of his depth. He was a man drowning in the very machine he professed to command. Amelia moved through the tilting corridors with a steady, practiced gait that defied the ship's violent motion. Her years on assault ships had given her sea legs of iron. The passengers were a panicked herd, but the crew members were worse. Their fear was educated. She could see it in the eyes of a young engineer she passed, his face smeared with grease, his hands trembling as he fumbled with a pressure valve on a coolant line. She stopped. "You're over-torquing it," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the din. "You'll shear the stem." The young man, barely out of his teens, glared at her, his fear curdling into aggression. "Who are you? Mind your own business, lady." Get back to your cabin! He gave the wrench another angry turn. Amy heard the faint but distinct ping of stressed metal. She shook her head and moved on. You couldn't help those who refused to see. But the sound of that straining valve echoed the larger failure. Volkov's men were flailing, treating symptoms without understanding the disease. The ship gave another deep, resonant shudder, and this time, the groan was followed by the high-pitched shriek of an alarm from below decks, a fire suppression system, most likely. They weren't just failing, they were making it worse. Her conscience, the stubborn marine part of her that refused to die, screamed at her. To stand by and do nothing was a form of desertion. She turned against the flow of terrified passengers and began the long climb up to the ship's nerve center, the bridge. The bridge was an oasis of controlled panic. Men and women in uniform moved with tense efficiency, their voices low and clipped. Captain Vance stood in the center, a grim statue staring out at the maelstrom. Amy stepped through the doorway, and a security officer immediately moved to block her. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. I need to speak to the captain," Amy said, her voice calm, devoid of the hysteria that had infected the rest of the ship. "It's an emergency." The officer's face hardened. "Everything is an emergency right now. Please return to." Just then, the bridge doors burst open and Chief Engineer Volkov stormed in, his face purple with rage and exertion. He was followed by a plume of acrid smoke that clung to his uniform. He saw Amy and his eyes bulged. "What is she doing here?" he roared, pointing a trembling, grease-stained finger. "I have enough problems without babysitting seasick tourists. Captain, tell this woman to get out of our way before I have her thrown out." Captain Vance, distracted and frayed, turned. He looked at the furious chief engineer, then at the strangely composed woman in the floral shirt. Her presence was an anomaly, an unwelcome distraction. "Ma'am, my officer is right. You need to leave." "We have this under." "No," Amy said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You don't." She took a step forward, her eyes locking with the captain's. "Your chief engineer is trying to force start the port turbine while ignoring a critical lubricant leak. He's flooded the primary bearings with seawater and triggered a Class Bravo fire in the auxiliary generator. Am I wrong?" Volkov's face went from purple to a shocking, bloodless white. Every officer on the bridge froze, turning to stare at the woman. Her words weren't a guess, they were a diagnosis, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon. A colossal wave, a moving wall of black water, slammed into the ship's port side. The world tilted at a terrifying angle. A junior officer screamed as he was thrown from his station. Alarms, shrill and insistent, blared from a dozen consoles at once. "Hull breach! Deck 4, Sections 7 and 8! We're taking on water!" another officer yelled. "We're being pushed toward the reef! Impact in 30 minutes at this rate!" Captain Vance grabbed a console for support, his mind reeling. 30 minutes. His ship, his passengers, his crew, had 30 minutes left. He looked at Volkov, who was stammering, his blustering facade completely shattered, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked useless. Then, his eyes fell on the woman. Amid the chaos, she hadn't moved. Her feet were planted, her expression was one of intense, focused calculation. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only knowledge. In that moment of absolute desperation, protocol shattered. The rules that had governed his entire career became meaningless. There was only the reef, the water, and the quiet woman who seemed to see through the skin of his ship and into its dying heart. He pushed himself upright. "Security, stand down," he commanded, his voice shaking but firm. He turned his full attention to Amy. "Hold on. Ma'am, you have my attention. You have 5 minutes to convince me you're not just a well-read passenger." Amelia didn't waste a single one of them. She didn't offer a resume or a plea. She spoke, and the language that flowed from her was not that of a tourist on vacation. It was a dense, rapid-fire stream of technical specifications, pressure ratings, and operational procedures. "Captain, your main gearing assembly is a Renktach and DSHL 2800. Your primary turbine seized not just from a lubricant pump failure, but from a catastrophic shearing of the impeller shaft within the pump housing, a known flaw in that model if maintenance cycles are extended. Your backup generator's automatic transfer switch is fried because when the port engine went, it created a massive power surge that the breakers couldn't handle. You're not just dead in the water, your entire power distribution manifold is compromised. I don't need to convince you. I need access to engineering. Now. The bridge crew stared, utterly stunned into silence. Even Captain Vance, who only understood half of what she said, recognized the absolute, irrefutable authority in her voice. This wasn't theory, it was first-hand experience. He gave a sharp, decisive nod to the security chief. Get her an escort. Give her anything she wants. Amy was already moving, not waiting for the escort, but leading the way. She moved with a purpose that seemed to bend the chaos around her. As she descended the ladderways into the belly of the ship, the path was one she seemed to know by instinct, a ghost navigating the anatomy of a familiar beast. The engine room was a vision of hell. The air was thick with the stench of ozone and hot metal, and choked with steam that hissed from ruptured pipes. The remaining crew members, their faces black with soot and despair, shouted over the roar of escaping pressure. It was organized chaos on the brink of total collapse. When Amy entered, flanked by a bewildered security guard, Dmitry Volkov saw her and bellowed with the last of his shredded authority. I said get her out of my engine room! This is a restricted zone! Amy didn't even grant him a glance. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, were already consuming the scene, scanning the banks of gauges, the flickering control panels, the panicked efforts of his men. She walked with a straight, unwavering line to the main control console, a sacred space Volkov considered his personal throne. Her fingers shot out, tapping a specific, darkened screen. This is your problem, she said, her voice cutting through the din like a laser. You're trying to bypass the primary fuel governor to restart the starboard turbine, but you haven't isolated the feedback loop from the damaged portside sensors. The computer thinks both engines are on fire. It's actively fighting you. The young engineer from the corridor stared at her, his jaw slack. He and two others had been trying to do exactly that for the last hour, meeting with nothing but failure. They had been fighting their own safety systems. You're insane, Volkov sputtered, his authority crumbling into dust. You can't just. You can't! Amy finally turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw the full force of the storm that lived behind her calm eyes. It was a storm of cold, hard-won certainty. No, you can't, she corrected him, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a command deck. You are going to lose this ship. She turned away from him, addressing the stunned and demoralized crew. Her voice rose, taking on a tone of command that was as natural to her as breathing. Listen up! I need a bypass manifold and a Class 3 torque wrench. You! She pointed to the young engineer. Isolate the port side heat exchanger and reroute its coolant feed to the starboard engine's oil cooler. We're going to cannibalize it. The plan was audacious, a desperate piece of battlefield engineering. Volkov found his voice, shrieking with disbelief. That's a multi-million-dollar system. You'll destroy it. It's against every regulation. Amy's gaze pinned him to the bulkhead. The exchanger is already failing from thermal stress. We sacrificed the part to save the whole. Or we can all stand here and quote regulations as we sink. Your choice, Chief Engineer. In that moment, the chain of command shattered and reformed. The crew, who had been following the orders of a panicking, incompetent leader, now saw a lifeline. They saw a plan where there was none. They saw competence where there was only bluster. One by one, they turned their backs on Volkov and looked to the woman in the floral shirt, their expressions shifting from fear to a dawning, desperate hope. They were no longer Volkov's crew. They were hers. A low, powerful thrum began to vibrate through the deck plates. It was a hesitant sound at first, a fragile pulse, then it grew in strength and confidence, swelling into the steady, life-affirming roar of a fully engaged turbine. The emergency red lights flickered and were replaced by the bright, clean white of the main power grid. On the bridge, the dead consoles blinked back to life, one after another, like stars reigniting in a dead sky. The ship, which had been rolling helplessly, gave a final, correcting lurch as its stabilizers and thrusters engaged. The voice of the helmsman, thick with emotion, cut through the stunned silence. "Captain? I have steering." The engine room was suddenly quiet, the chaos replaced by the rhythmic hum of controlled power. The crew stood frozen, staring at Amelia. Her hands were covered in grease, a smudge of soot was smeared across her cheek, but she stood tall, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. They weren't just looking at a tourist. They were looking at their savior. Dmitri Volkov had slumped against a far bulkhead, his face buried in his hands, a broken man in the heart of a machine that no longer obeyed him. Captain Vance's voice, raw and filled with a profound, trembling relief, crackled over the engine room intercom. "Engineering. What is your status?" The young engineer, the one who had told Amy to mind her own business, looked at her, his eyes wide with an emotion that bordered on worship. She gave him a slight nod. He keyed the microphone, his hand shaking. "Starboard engine online and holding steady, Captain. Propulsion is ours." There was a pause. Then Vance's voice came again, softer this time, filled with a question that hung over the entire ship. "And the passenger? Who is she?" The Odyssey of the Seas, battered but alive, limped into the port of St. John's under its own power, escorted by a Coast Guard cutter whose assistance was no longer needed. The subsequent investigation by the maritime authorities and the cruise line was swift and decisive. In a sterile corporate boardroom, a thin file was placed on a polished table in front of a panel of grim-faced executives and Captain Vance. The cover sheet read, "Hayes, Amelia R." Inside, the story was laid bare. Chief Warrant Officer for Amelia Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired. A legend in the esoteric world of marine engineering. Her specialty, power plant diagnostics and expeditionary repair for amphibious assault ships and landing craft air cushion vehicles, the most complex and high-strung propulsion systems in the military. The file was filled with commendations for ingenuity under extreme duress and exceptional leadership in catastrophic failure scenarios. Dmitri Volkov was formally stripped of his chief engineer's license and faced a litany of civil and criminal charges for gross negligence. Captain Vance, in a final ceremony before the passengers disembarked, stood on a makeshift stage in the ship's main atrium. He called Amelia to the front. The crowd, once a panicked mob, was now a silent, respectful sea of faces. They knew who she was. They knew what she had done. "We are taught that heroes wear uniforms," Vance said, his voice resonating with humility. "But sometimes they wear floral shirts and walk among us, waiting for the moment they are needed. Ms. Hayes did not just save our ship. She reminded us that true authority comes not from a title, but from competence, and true courage is the willingness to act when others are frozen by fear." He presented her with the cruise line's highest civilian honor, but more than that, he looked her in the eye and said, "On behalf of my entire crew, I apologize." "And I thank you." Amy accepted with a quiet nod. The applause was deafening. Standing there, she no longer felt like a ghost, adrift in a world that didn't fit. She had found her footing again, not in the memory of the uniform she once wore, but in the unshakable truth of who she had always been. She was a Marine. And she was home.